Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that every moment of pleasure you've ever chased, every scroll through social media, every binge-watch session, every impulsive purchase, every swipe right, was not making you happier, but systematically destroying your capacity for genuine fulfillment. Imagine realizing that what you believed was freedom was actually the most sophisticated form of slavery ever devised. You reach for your phone before your feet hit the floor. The dopamine hits your brain like a familiar drug as notifications flood your screen. You feel that brief spark of satisfaction, followed immediately by the hollow ache that demands more. More content, more stimulation, more pleasure. But here's the paradox that should terrify you. The more pleasure you consume, the less capable you become of experiencing it. Aldous Huxley predicted this nightmare in 1932, but he wasn't writing science fiction, he was writing prophecy. In Brave New World, he envisioned a society where people were controlled not through pain and punishment, but through endless pleasure and instant gratification. No chains were needed, no guards were required. The prisoners locked themselves in their cells and threw away the keys, believing they were living in paradise. But what if I told you that Huxley's dystopia isn't coming? It's already here. What if the most dangerous form of control isn't the boot stamping on a human face forever, but the gentle hand offering you exactly what you think you want, precisely when you want it? Think about your last hour. How many times did you reach for your phone without conscious intention? How many minutes disappeared into the void of endless scrolling? How many decisions did you make not based on what would fulfill you, but on what would provide the quickest hit of pleasure? You're not weak. You're not lacking willpower. You're responding exactly as you were designed to respond. But the question is, who did the designing? Every major corporation, every social media platform, every streaming service, every food company has teams of neuroscientists, behavioral psychologists, and data analysts working around the clock to hijack the most primitive parts of your brain. They're not selling you products, they're selling you the promise of pleasure. And they've discovered something that would have made the slave masters of history weep with envy. The most effective chains are the ones people forge for themselves. Consider this. You have access to more pleasure, more entertainment, more stimulation than any generation in human history. You can order any food with a tap, watch any movie instantly, connect with anyone anywhere, buy anything you desire. You are living in what should be paradise. So why are rates of depression, anxiety, and existential emptiness higher than ever? Why do you feel more restless, more dissatisfied, more hungry for something you can't name? The answer lies in a cruel biological irony. Your brain evolved over millions of years to survive in a world of scarcity, where pleasure was rare and precious. But now you live in a world of abundance, where pleasure is infinite and instant. The same neural pathways that once motivated your ancestors to survive are now being weaponized against you. Every notification, every recommended video, every targeted ad is designed to trigger the same neural responses that once meant the difference between life and death. But here's what they don't want you to realize. Pleasure and happiness are not the same thing. Pleasure is temporary, external, and addictive. Happiness is enduring, internal, and fulfilling. Pleasure requires constantly increasing doses to achieve the same effect. Happiness compounds over time. Pleasure makes you dependent. Happiness makes you free. You've been sold a lie so convincing that questioning it feels like questioning reality itself. The lie is this: more pleasure equals more happiness. More stimulation equals more satisfaction. More options equals more freedom. But what if the opposite is true? What if the relentless pursuit of pleasure is the very thing that's stealing your capacity for lasting fulfillment? This isn't just about willpower or self-control. This is about recognizing that you're fighting a war you didn't know you were in, against enemies you can't see, using weapons you don't understand. And the battlefield is your own mind. If you're ready to understand how the pursuit of pleasure has become the pursuit of slavery, how the promise of freedom has become the mechanism of control, and how you can break free from chains you never realized you were wearing, then subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Because what you're about to discover will change not just how you see pleasure, but how you see the entire architecture of modern life. The question isn't whether you're addicted to pleasure. The question is whether you're ready to admit it. And more importantly, whether you're ready to do something about it. To understand how we became slaves to pleasure, we must first understand what Aldous Huxley called the ultimate revolution, a form of control so subtle, so seductive, that its victims would defend their own enslavement. But Huxley wasn't the first to recognize this trap. 2 centuries earlier, Arthur Schopenhauer identified the fundamental flaw in human nature that makes this slavery possible. We are creatures driven by insatiable will, forever oscillating between the pain of wanting and the boredom of having. Schopenhauer observed that human existence is essentially suffering, not because life is inherently tragic, but because we are biologically programmed to never be satisfied. The moment we achieve what we desire, the desire itself disappears, leaving us empty until the next craving emerges. This is what he called the pendulum of human existence, swinging eternally between the agony of want and the emptiness of fulfillment. But here's where our modern predicament becomes truly sinister. In Schopenhauer's time, this cycle had natural limitations. Desires took time to fulfill, pleasure required effort to obtain, boredom had space to exist, and in that space, deeper satisfactions could emerge. Today, technology has collapsed these natural boundaries. The pendulum swings faster and faster until it becomes a blur of perpetual stimulation that masquerades as satisfaction. Carl Jung understood the psychological mechanism behind this trap. He recognized that what we call civilization often works against our deepest psychological needs. Jung identified the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress and deny, and warned that when we don't integrate these aspects consciously, they control us unconsciously. Modern pleasure-seeking is shadow, behavior masquerading as self-care. We tell ourselves we deserve that extra hour of scrolling, that we're treating ourselves with another purchase, that we're relaxing with another binge-watch session. But underneath lies the shadow truth. We're avoiding the discomfort of genuine self-confrontation. The brilliant manipulation lies in how pleasure has been rebranded as self-actualization. The same impulses that once led to recognized addictions, gambling, drinking, eating, are now packaged as lifestyle choices and personal empowerment. You're not addicted to social media, you're staying connected. You're not compulsively shopping, you're investing in yourself. You're not avoiding reality through constant entertainment, you're practicing self-care. Friedrich Nietzsche predicted this exact cultural shift. He warned of the coming of the last man, human beings so comfortable, so saturated with small pleasures, that they would lose all capacity for greatness, for suffering, for growth. These last men would blink and say, "We have discovered happiness," not realizing they had actually discovered a sophisticated form of spiritual death. Sound familiar? The neurological reality makes this philosophical insight concrete. Dr. Anna Lemke's research reveals that our brains operate on a pleasure-pain balance. Every spike of pleasure is automatically followed by an equal and opposite pain response. The more intense and frequent the pleasure, the deeper the subsequent pain. What we interpret as needing more is actually our brain's attempt to restore balance by pushing us toward increasingly desperate pleasure-seeking. But the cruelest aspect of this system is how it hijacks our natural reward pathways. Evolutionary psychologist Dr. Robert Sapolsky explains that our dopamine system evolved not to make us happy, but to make us want. Dopamine doesn't spike when you get pleasure. It spikes in anticipation of pleasure. Every notification sound, every loading symbol, every swipe gesture triggers dopamine release before you even see the content. You're not addicted to the pleasure itself. You're addicted to the anticipation of pleasure. This creates what Jean-Paul Sartre would have recognized as bad faith, the human tendency to deny our freedom and responsibility by pretending we have no choice. You tell yourself you can't help. Checking your phone. You can't stop buying things you don't need. You can't resist the urge to consume just one more piece of content. But this helplessness is an illusion maintained by your unwillingness to confront the deeper emptiness that all this pleasure-seeking is designed to avoid. Viktor Frankl, writing from the concentration camps, identified the core of this problem. When life lacks meaning, people will seek pleasure as a substitute. He called this the existential vacuum, the emptiness that emerges when people have everything they think they want, but nothing they genuinely need. Modern consumer culture has industrialized this vacuum, turning existential emptiness into profit. The philosophical implications are staggering. We live in the first civilization in human history where the primary threat to human potential isn't scarcity or oppression, but abundance and comfort. The very things our ancestors fought and died to achieve, endless food, constant entertainment, infinite choice, have become the instruments of our spiritual imprisonment. This isn't happening by accident. It's the result of what Aldous Huxley's brother Julian called the conditioning of human beings for the benefit of the conditioners. Every aspect of modern life is designed to keep you in a state of perpetual mild dissatisfaction that can only be temporarily relieved through consumption. You are not the customer. You are the product being optimized for maximum extractable value. The deeper horror is that this system has made traditional forms of resistance obsolete. You can't rebel against pleasure. You can't protest against getting exactly what you think you want. The chains are invisible because they're made of silk, and they feel so good that questioning them seems insane. The most insidious aspect of pleasure slavery isn't what it does to you in obvious ways. It's how it rewires your reality so subtly that you don't notice the transformation until it's complete. You don't wake up one day suddenly unable to concentrate. You don't suddenly lose the ability to be alone with your thoughts. You don't immediately become incapable of delayed gratification. It happens so gradually, so pleasantly, that by the time you realize what's been lost, you can barely remember what it felt like to have it. Consider your attention span. Neuroscientist Dr. Adam Ghazali's research reveals that the average human attention span has decreased from 12 seconds in 2000 to 8 seconds today, less than that of a goldfish. But this isn't just a cute statistic. Your ability to sustain attention is the foundation of every meaningful human capacity. Deep relationships, creative work, spiritual development, complex problem solving, and genuine self-understanding. When you lose the ability to pay attention, you lose the ability to be fully human. But the pleasure economy depends on destroying your attention. Every app, every platform, every device is designed around what tech insiders call the attention economy, a system where your focus is harvested, processed, and sold to the highest bidder. Your scattered attention isn't a side effect of technology, it's the primary product. You think you're using these platforms, but they're using you, and what they're using is your most precious resource, your conscious awareness. The cognitive. Scientist Dr. Larry Rosen has documented what he calls continuous partial attention, a state where you're always partially focused on multiple streams of stimulation, but never fully present to any single experience. This creates what appears to be productivity and connectivity, but is actually a form of existential fragmentation. You're everywhere and nowhere, connected to everything and present to nothing. This fragmentation extends into your relationships in ways that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. MIT professor Sherry Turkle's research shows that people now prefer texting to talking, even in intimate relationships, because digital communication allows them to edit, curate, and control their presentation. But this preference for mediated connection is actually a preference for the illusion of intimacy without its risks and demands. Real intimacy requires presence, vulnerability, and the acceptance of discomfort. It demands that you sit with another person's pain, their complexity, their unpredictability. But the pleasure-seeking mind gravitates toward relationships that feel good rather than relationships that are good. You end up surrounded by connections that provide immediate emotional gratification but lack the depth and challenge that create genuine human bonds. The consequences extend into your relationship with work and meaning. Psychologist Dr. Tim Kaz's research on materialism reveals that the more people focus on external rewards, money, status, pleasure, approval, the less satisfied they become with life, even when they achieve those rewards. This creates what he calls the materialistic value system, a way of organizing life around the pursuit of external validation that systematically undermines internal sources of meaning. But perhaps the most devastating consequence is what happens to your relationship with discomfort. The constant availability of pleasure has made you allergic to any form of psychological difficulty. Boredom, loneliness, anxiety, frustration, these natural human experiences have been reframed as problems to be immediately solved rather than information to be understood. Dr. Manoush Zomorodi's research on boredom reveals that these supposedly negative states are actually when your brain does its most important work, consolidating memories, making creative connections, processing emotions, and developing self-understanding. When you eliminate discomfort through constant stimulation, you eliminate the very conditions that allow psychological growth and self-discovery. This creates what psychologists call emotional brittleness, an inability to tolerate the normal fluctuations of human experience. Every minor setback becomes a crisis. Every moment of boredom becomes unbearable. Every social interaction that doesn't provide immediate gratification becomes threatening. You become like a muscle that has never been exercised, weak, fragile, and easily injured by the normal stresses of existence. The behavioral economist Dr. Dan Ariely has documented how this pleasure-seeking rewires your decision-making in predictable ways. You become increasingly present-biased, choosing smaller immediate rewards over larger delayed ones. You develop what he calls decision fatigue, a state where the constant need to choose between infinite options exhausts your capacity for meaningful choice. Paradoxically, having more options makes you less free, not more. This shows up in every area of life. You scroll through Netflix for 20 minutes, unable to choose what to watch, then feel anxious about whether you made the right choice. You have access to more potential romantic partners than ever through dating apps, but develop a grass is greener mentality that prevents you from committing to any relationship. You can order any food, buy any product, consume any content, but the abundance of choice becomes its own form of paralysis. The cultural consequences are equally profound. Sociologist Dr. Robert Putnam documented the collapse of what he calls social capital, the networks of relationships, civic engagement, and community involvement that make societies function. As people retreat into private pleasure-seeking, the shared institutions and common experiences that bind communities together deteriorate. You end up living in what sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called liquid modernity, a world where everything solid melts into air, where all relationships become temporary, all commitments become conditional, and all meaning becomes subjective. This isn't freedom. It's the dissolution of the very foundations that make freedom meaningful. But perhaps most tragically, this system has made you complicit in your own diminishment. You defend the very forces that are diminishing you. You argue for your right to be distracted, your right to be comfortable, your right to avoid difficulty. You've been convinced that resistance to pleasure is repression, that delayed gratification is self-punishment, that any limitation on your desires is a limitation on your freedom. The result is a form of soft totalitarianism that would have amazed the dictators of the past. No force is required, no surveillance is needed. You police yourself, limit yourself, and diminish yourself, all while believing you're pursuing happiness and freedom. The path to freedom from pleasure slavery begins with a radical realization that will feel completely counterintuitive. The way out isn't through willpower or restriction, it's through embracing discomfort as your greatest teacher and pleasure. As your most dangerous advisor, everything you've been told about happiness, success, and the good life has been designed to keep you trapped. Real liberation requires you to do the opposite of what feels natural. Marcus Aurelius understood this paradox 2,000 years ago when he wrote in his private journals, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." But Aurelius wasn't advocating for positive thinking or gratitude practices. He was pointing to something far more radical, the recognition that your happiness depends not on getting what you want, but on wanting what you already have, or better yet, wanting nothing at all. This isn't about becoming a monk or rejecting all pleasure. It's about understanding the difference between pleasure that serves you and pleasure that enslaves you. The Stoics called this preferred indifference, and things that are pleasant when they occur, but whose absence doesn't diminish your well-being. The moment you need something external to feel complete, you've handed over your freedom to that thing. The first act of rebellion is what Friedrich Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values. You must question every assumption about what constitutes the good life. Is constant entertainment really better than occasional boredom? Is having infinite choices really better than having clear constraints? Is being always connected really better than sometimes being alone? Is immediate gratification really better than delayed satisfaction? Dr. Judson Brewer's neuroscience research reveals something revolutionary. The brain pathways that create addiction are the same pathways that create liberation when used consciously. The key is learning to observe your cravings without immediately acting on them. This isn't suppression, it's investigation. When you feel the urge to reach for your phone, to buy something you don't need, to consume another piece of content, pause and study the sensation itself. What you'll discover is that every craving has a life cycle. It rises, peaks, and naturally subsides, but only if you don't feed it. The moment you satisfy a craving, you reset the cycle and make it stronger. But when you observe it without acting, you begin to see through the illusion of its urgency. Most of what feels absolutely necessary is actually completely optional. The ancient practice of fasting, not eating, but fasting from stimulation, becomes a revolutionary act in a culture built on constant consumption. Try spending 1 hour without any input. No phone, no music, no reading, no talking. Just you and your thoughts. Most people find this terrifying because they've never met themselves without distraction. But in that discomfort lies the beginning of genuine self-knowledge. Viktor Frankl discovered in the concentration camps that the one freedom that can never be taken from you is the freedom to choose your response to any situation. But this freedom only exists when you create space between stimulus and response. Constant pleasure-seeking eliminates that space, making you a puppet of your impulses. Recovery begins when you reclaim that gap. The Buddhist concept of noble boredom offers a practical framework for this reclamation. Instead of viewing boredom as a problem to be solved, treat it as information about your relationship with reality. Boredom often signals that you're expecting entertainment from life rather than creating meaning within it. The cure for boredom isn't more stimulation, it's deeper engagement with what's actually present. This leads to perhaps the most counterintuitive truth. The people who appear to be depriving themselves of pleasure often experience more genuine satisfaction than those who indulge every desire. The monk who owns nothing may be happier than the billionaire who owns everything. Not because poverty is better than wealth, but because the monk has learned to find abundance in simplicity, while the billionaire searches for simplicity in abundance. Dr. Angela Duckworth's research on grit reveals that the ability to delay gratification, to choose long-term satisfaction over short-term pleasure, is a better predictor of life satisfaction than intelligence, talent, or socioeconomic status. But developing grit isn't about white-knuckling your way through temptation. It's about developing what she calls hierarchical goal structures, knowing what you're saying yes to when you say no to immediate pleasure. The ancient Spartans had a practice called ponos, deliberately choosing difficult paths to build psychological resilience. Modern neuroscience confirms what they knew intuitively. The brain grows stronger through challenge, not comfort. Every time you choose difficulty over ease, delayed gratification over immediate pleasure, you're literally rewiring your neural pathways toward greater freedom. But perhaps the most powerful form of rebellion is what Carl Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be or who others expect you to be. This requires confronting what Jung called your shadow, all the aspects of yourself you've been avoiding through constant pleasure-seeking. The shadow often contains not just your weaknesses, but your greatest strengths, the parts of yourself that don't fit into the consumer identity you've been sold. When you stop medicating your discomfort with pleasure, you create space for these authentic aspects of yourself to emerge. The practical steps are simpler than you might expect, but they require what Søren Kierkegaard called the leap, A commitment to act against your immediate impulses in service of your deeper values. Start with small acts of voluntary discomfort. Take cold showers, exercise when you don't feel like it, meditate when you're restless, read books instead of watching videos, walk instead of taking transportation when possible. These aren't punishments, they're practices in choosing your responses, rather than being chosen by your impulses. Each small act of conscious difficulty builds what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to remain functional and focused even when experiencing discomfort. The ultimate rebellion against pleasure slavery is the recognition that you don't need to feel good to do good. You don't need to be comfortable to be productive, and you don't need to be entertained to be fulfilled. When you truly understand this, you become dangerous to every system that depends on your compulsive consumption. You become free. Here's the truth that will either liberate you or terrify you, depending on how ready you are to hear it. You were never meant to be happy. Not in the way you've been taught to understand happiness. You were meant to be something far more profound, far more dangerous and far more alive. You were meant to be awake. The entire pleasure industrial complex depends on a fundamental lie that the goal of human existence is to feel good. But what if feeling good was never the point? What if the relentless pursuit of pleasure isn't just failing to make you happy? What if it's actively preventing you from discovering what you actually are? Arthur Schopenhauer spent his life studying this question and arrived at a conclusion so radical, it's still considered heretical today. The will to live, that driving force behind all desire, all pleasure-seeking, all craving, is not your friend. It's a cosmic joke played on consciousness itself. You think you want things because they will make you happy, but you actually want things because you are possessed by an impersonal force that cares nothing for your well-being and everything for its own perpetuation. But here's where Schopenhauer's insight becomes genuinely revolutionary. The moment you see through this illusion, the moment you recognize that you are not your desires, not your cravings, not your endless hunger for more, something extraordinary happens. The will loses its grip on you, not because you've defeated it through willpower, but because you've seen through its fundamental deception. This is what the mystics of every tradition have pointed toward when they speak of enlightenment, liberation, or awakening. They're not describing a feeling or an experience. They're describing the end of the search for feelings and experiences. They're describing what remains when you stop trying to become something other than what you already are. Carl Jung understood this from a psychological perspective when he wrote about what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposing forces in consciousness simultaneously without being torn apart by the tension. Most people escape this tension through pleasure, through distraction, through the endless search for something that will finally make them whole. But Jung discovered that wholeness doesn't come from adding something to yourself. It comes from integrating what's already there, including the parts you've been trying to escape. The deepest truth about pleasure addiction is that it's not really about pleasure at all. It's about avoiding the encounter with your own existence. Every scroll, every purchase, every hit of dopamine is a way of saying not now to the fundamental questions of who you are and why you're here. But these questions don't disappear when you ignore them. They accumulate in the shadows of your consciousness, growing more urgent and more powerful until they can no longer be avoided. Aldous Huxley discovered this truth through his experiments with consciousness-altering substances, but he realized that the real revelation wasn't what he experienced during those altered states. It was what he discovered about ordinary consciousness. He saw that what we call normal consciousness is actually a highly filtered, highly conditioned way of experiencing reality that protects us from seeing things as they actually are. Most people live their entire lives without ever experiencing reality directly. Every experience is mediated through the filter of, how does this make me feel? Or what can I get from this? Or how does this serve my desires? But what if you could experience something, anything, without that filter? What if you could encounter a sunset, a conversation, a moment of stillness without immediately trying to extract pleasure or meaning or utility from it? This is what the Zen masters call ordinary mind, the capacity to experience reality without The overlay of wanting it to be different. It's not a special state that requires years of meditation to achieve. It's actually your natural condition before it gets obscured by the endless commentary of desire and aversion. The final revelation is this: you already have everything you've been searching for through pleasure, not metaphorically, not spiritually. Actually, the peace you're seeking through entertainment already exists in the spaces between thoughts. The connection you're craving through social media already exists in your direct encounter with this present moment. The fulfillment you're chasing through consumption already exists in the simple fact of your own existence. But recognizing this requires giving up the one thing that feels most precious to you, the story that you are incomplete, that you need something, that you are a problem to be solved or a project to be improved. This story is the foundation of the entire consumer economy. It's what makes you valuable to the systems that profit from your dissatisfaction. When you truly understand that you are not your desires, not your thoughts, not your endless hunger for more, something shifts that can never be undone. You don't become indifferent to pleasure or pain. You become free from the compulsion to avoid one and chase the other. You can enjoy a beautiful meal without needing to post about it. You can feel sadness without immediately trying to fix it. You can be alone without frantically reaching for distraction. This freedom is what every great teacher has pointed toward, using whatever language and concepts were available in their time and culture. Buddha called it the end of suffering. Jesus called it the kingdom of heaven that's already here. Marcus Aurelius called it living according to nature. Jung called it individuation. But they were all describing the same fundamental shift from being enslaved by the content of consciousness to being free as consciousness itself. The practical implication is both simple and revolutionary. You don't need to wait for anything to change to experience this freedom. You don't need to achieve anything, overcome anything, or become anything. You need to recognize what's already here, what's always been here, what could never not be here, the aware presence that's reading these words right now. This recognition doesn't require you to give up pleasure or embrace suffering. It requires you to see through the fundamental illusion that your well-being depends on any particular configuration of experience. When you see this clearly, pleasure becomes lighter, suffering becomes more workable, and the desperate search for happiness reveals itself as the very thing that was preventing happiness from being recognized. Tell me in the comments, what would your life look like if you stopped trying to feel good and started allowing yourself to be awake? And if this perspective has shifted something in you, share this video with someone who might be ready to question everything they think they know about happiness and freedom. The revolution begins the moment you stop trying to improve your prison and start recognizing you were never imprisoned at all.